The morning sun cast long shadows across the polished marble floors of Regional Trust Bank as a well-dressed man in his mid-40s approached the building. His name was Richard Chen, and while his casual business attire, a navy blazer and crisp khaki pants, might have seemed understated, the wisdom in his eyes and confidence in his stride told a different story. Just last week, Richard had finalized the purchase of this struggling downtown bank branch, a move that few knew about. After 20 years of building his career from scratch, working double shifts, studying late into the night, and saving every penny, he had finally achieved what many said was impossible: owning a bank. This morning was different, though. Instead of walking in through the executive entrance or announcing himself, Richard decided to do something unusual. He wanted to see how his new bank really operated when nobody knew the boss was watching. Sometimes you learn more by being silent and observing, his grandmother used to say, and those words had guided him through many challenging situations in life. As he pushed through the heavy glass doors, the familiar scent of coffee and paper filled the air. The bank was already bustling with early morning customers. Some were small business owners clutching deposit bags, others were elderly folks waiting patiently for their turn, and a few were young professionals quickly trying to handle their banking before rushing to work. Richard took his place in line, standing behind a friendly-looking elderly woman who was sharing stories about her grandchildren with anyone who would listen. He smiled, thinking about how banks were more than just buildings with money. They were places where community happened, where dreams got funded, where futures were built. From his spot in line, Richard noticed things that both impressed and concerned him. The marble floors gleamed perfectly, and the counters were spotless. That was good. But he also noticed how some customers were greeted with warm smiles while others barely got a glance. He watched as a young man in work boots was directed to wait longer, while a woman in expensive jewelry was immediately attended to. Every interaction, every raised eyebrow, every whispered comment between tellers, Richard absorbed it all. The security guard by the door kept giving him suspicious glances, and Richard could feel the weight of unwelcoming stares from some of the employees. He'd felt these stares before, throughout his career, but they hadn't stopped him then, and they wouldn't stop him now. He just pulled out his phone and pretended to check emails, all while making mental notes about everything he observed. As the line slowly moved forward, Richard thought about his plans for this place. He dreamed of transforming it into a bank that would serve everyone equally, from the construction worker cashing his weekly check to the business owner seeking a loan to expand her company. His own struggles to get banking services early in his career had taught him just how important fair treatment was. Standing there, watching customer after customer proceed to the tellers, Richard felt both excitement and determination building inside him. The morning sun now streamed fully through the tall windows, creating bright patterns on the floor. He knew that soon enough, he would step forward, and everything in this bank would change. But for now, he waited patiently in line, just another customer in casual business wear, carrying with him a vision for something better. Little did the employees know that their routine morning was about to become anything but ordinary, and the man they were looking at so suspiciously was about to teach them one of life's most valuable lessons. The tension in the bank lobby grew thicker as Richard Chen moved closer to the front of the line. He noticed how the young teller's smile dropped when making eye contact with him, quickly turning to whisper something to her colleague. The whispers spread like ripples in a pond, from one employee to another, creating an atmosphere that was all too familiar to him. A well-dressed couple walked in through the glass doors, and without hesitation, another teller waved them forward, completely ignoring the proper line order. "I can help you right over here," she called out cheerfully, while Richard and others who had been waiting longer watched in disbelief. An elderly man behind Richard muttered under his breath about the unfairness, but nobody spoke up. Richard observed how the bank's employees moved with rehearsed efficiency for some customers while dragging their feet for others. A young woman in medical scrubs had just been told the system was running slow, and she'd have to wait, while right next to her, another customer was quickly served with a bright smile and a "have a wonderful day." As he stood there, Richard remembered his own struggles from years ago. He thought out the countless times he'd been denied loans despite having an excellent credit score, the occasions when bank employees had questioned the legitimacy of his checks, and the moments when he'd been made to feel like an outsider in places that were supposed to serve everyone equally. The security guard had now positioned himself closer to Richard's spot in line, pretending to check his phone while keeping a watchful eye. Richard could feel the guard's stare burning into the back of his head, but he maintained his composure. Years of dealing with such treatment had taught him that reaction was exactly what they expected, and exactly what he wouldn't give them. Finally, Richard reached the front of the line. The teller, a middle-aged woman with reading glasses hanging from her neck, barely looked up as she called out, "Next, please." Her tone was notably different from the cheerful voice she'd used with previous customers. When she finally raised her eyes to look at Richard, her expression hardened. "How can I help you?" she asked, her voice carrying a hint of suspicion that Richard had heard countless times before. He noticed how her hand slowly moved toward the security button under her desk, a movement she probably thought was subtle but one that Richard's experienced eyes caught immediately. Just as Richard opened his mouth to speak, another employee, wearing a name tag that identified her as the branch manager, approached the counter. She had been watching the situation unfold and had apparently decided to intervene before Richard could even state his business. "Sir," the manager said, her voice carrying that false politeness that barely masked her true intentions. "I'm afraid we're experiencing some technical difficulties with our system right now. Perhaps you'd like to try another branch?" She smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. Richard remained perfectly calm, his hands clasped in front of him. The same hands that had just signed the ownership papers for this very bank last week. He could feel the eyes of other customers on him, some sympathetic, others simply uncomfortable with the unfolding scene. The branch manager's smile began to fade as Richard didn't immediately turn to leave. The security guard took a few steps closer, his hand resting on his radio. The tension in the air was almost electric now, with bank employees exchanging glances and customers watching the scene unfold like a slow-motion movie. Little did they know, the next few minutes would completely transform their understanding of assumptions, prejudice, and consequences. The day's biggest surprise was about to unfold, and not a single person in that bank lobby, except for Richard, could have predicted what was coming next. The atmosphere in the bank had reached a boiling point. The branch manager stood there, arms crossed, waiting for Richard to leave. But he remained perfectly still, his calm presence seemingly irritating her even more. The security guard had now moved to stand directly behind him, close enough that Richard could hear the crackle of his radio. "Sir," the manager said, her voice growing firmer, "I believe I've made myself clear. We reserve the right to refuse service to—" She paused, carefully choosing her next words. "Anyone who might disrupt our normal business operations." Richard raised an eyebrow, his voice steady and clear. "And how exactly am I disrupting your operations?" he asked politely. The simple question seemed to catch the manager off guard. She glanced around nervously, aware that other customers were watching the scene unfold. An elderly woman who had been filling out deposit slips nearby spoke up. "I don't see him disrupting anything," she said loudly, her voice shaking with disapproval at the situation. But the bank staff seemed determined to ignore her comment. The teller who had first seen Richard was now half hidden behind her computer screen, pretending to be busy with paperwork. Other employees whispered amongst themselves, some looking uncomfortable with the situation, but none stepping forward to intervene. Just then, Richard's phone began to ring. The sound cut through the tense silence like a knife. He calmly reached into his pocket and checked the caller ID. A slight smile crossed his face as he answered, putting the phone on speaker, a move that would change everything. "Good morning, Mr. Chen," boomed a cheerful voice through the speaker. "I'm just checking to see how your first visit to your new branch is going. The board is excited to hear your initial impressions of the operations at Regional Trust." The color drained from the branch manager's face. The security guard's hand dropped from his radio. The whispering among the employees stopped instantly, replaced by a deafening silence. "Well, Mr. Thompson," Richard replied calmly, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent lobby, "I've certainly gotten an interesting perspective on how our branch treats different customers." He emphasized the word "our," watching as realization dawned on every face in the room. The branch manager's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. The teller who had been hiding behind her computer screen slowly emerged, her face pale with shock. The security guard took several steps back, suddenly finding great interest in his shoes. "That's wonderful," Mr. Thompson continued through the speaker, completely unaware of the scene unfolding in the bank. "As the new owner, I'm sure you'll have plenty of insights to share at next week's board meeting." The word "owner" echoed through the lobby like a thunderclap. A customer in line dropped their deposit slip. The elderly woman who had spoken up earlier broke into a knowing smile, nodding approvingly at Richard. The branch manager's professional demeanor crumbled completely. "Mr. Chen, I had no idea. Please, let me explain," she stammered, her earlier confidence evaporating into thin air. Richard held up his hand gently, stopping her mid-sentence. The power dynamic had shifted dramatically, but his calm demeanor hadn't changed one bit. He was still the same person they had tried to throw out minutes ago. Only now they knew who he really was. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson," Richard spoke into the phone. "I'll have a full report ready for the board meeting. I've seen exactly what I needed to see today." He ended the call and looked around the lobby, meeting every pair of eyes that would now make contact with his. The moment hung in the air like a suspended drop of water, ready to fall. Every person in that bank lobby knew they were witnessing something important, something that would have lasting consequences. And Richard Chen, standing there with the same dignity he'd shown from the moment he walked in, was about to show them all what true leadership looked like. In the moments following the phone call, the bank lobby felt like a theater where the final act of a powerful play was unfolding. Richard pulled out his wallet and removed his business card, along with the official bank ownership documents he'd been carrying. He placed them gently on the counter, where they seemed to carry the weight of everything that had just happened. The branch manager picked up the card with trembling hands, her face shifting through various shades of red. The security guard had backed away completely, now standing awkwardly by the entrance, looking like he wished the ground would swallow him whole. Some employees had tears in their eyes, while others seemed frozen in place, unable to process what was happening. "I think," Richard said softly but firmly, "we should all meet in the conference room." His voice carried no anger, no desire for revenge, just a quiet authority that made everyone listen. "Please ask all available staff to join us. And Lisa," he turned to the branch manager, addressing her by the name on her tag, "please put up the temporarily closed sign for the next hour." As customers were politely asked to return later, many lingered, curious to see how things would unfold. The elderly woman who had spoken up earlier approached Richard. "You show them what real leadership looks like, young man," she whispered, patting his arm before leaving. The employees filed into the conference room like children called to the principal's office. Some couldn't meet Richard's eyes, while others seemed on the verge of offering rushed explanations or apologies. The room, usually used for loan meetings and staff gatherings, now felt more like a courtroom. Richard stood at the head of the table, his presence commanding attention without demanding it. The sunlight streaming through the windows cast interesting patterns on the wall behind him, almost like a spotlight on this unexpected moment of truth. "I want to tell you a story," he began, his voice gentle but clear. 10 years ago, I walked into a bank much like this one. I had a business plan, excellent credit, and all the necessary documents to apply for a loan. He paused, letting his words sink in. I was turned away before I could even sit down with a loan officer. The room was so quiet you could hear the gentle hum of the air conditioning. Every person there knew exactly why he had been turned away, and the shame of their recent behavior hung heavy in the air. But that's not where my story ends, Richard continued. Instead of getting up, I worked harder. I found other ways, other opportunities. I promised myself that one day I would be in a position to change things. He looked around the room, meeting each person's eyes. That day is today. A young teller in the back raised her hand hesitantly, like a student in class. When Richard nodded at her, she spoke with a shaking voice. Are we all fired? The question that had been on everyone's mind finally hung in the open air. Richard's response surprised them all. He smiled, not a cruel smile of revenge, but a genuine one of hope. No, he said firmly. Firing you would be easy. Teaching and learning from each other, that's the harder path. And that's the path we're going to take. The tension in the room shifted slightly. Confusion replaced fear in many faces. They had expected anger, punishment, pink slips, not this calm offer of education and growth. Starting tomorrow, Richard continued, we're going to implement changes, real changes, not just in policies, but in how we think, how we treat people, how we serve our community. He pulled out a notebook from his blazer pocket. But first, I want to hear from each of you. I want to understand why you do things the way you do, and how we can do better. The atmosphere in the conference room began to transform. As Richard stood there, ready to listen rather than condemn, the real work of change was about to begin. This wasn't just about one man proving people wrong. It was about transforming an entire system, one conversation at a time. The conference room became a space of raw honesty as employees began to share their stories. Richard sat patiently, listening to each person speak. The branch manager, still visibly shaken, was the first to find her courage. I've been in banking for 20 years, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. We were always taught to be careful about certain types of customers. She stopped, realizing how terrible it sounded when said out loud. I never questioned it. I just followed what I was taught. Richard nodded, not in agreement, but in understanding. He pulled out a small notebook and started writing. And that's exactly why the banking system needs to change, he said. We're not just storing money here. We're storing people's dreams, their futures, their children's education funds. A younger employee raised his hand. Last month, a construction worker came in with muddy boots. My supervisor told me to direct him to the ATM outside instead of serving him at the counter. His voice cracked with shame. He just wanted to deposit his paycheck, but we made him feel unwelcome in his own community bank. The room grew quieter with each confession. Years of ingrained prejudices and unwritten rules were being brought into the light. Some employees cried silently, others stared at their hands, and a few seemed to be truly seeing their actions clearly for the first time. Let me share something with you, Richard said, standing up and walking to the whiteboard. He drew a simple picture of a bank. When I was growing up, my grandmother cleaned banks like this one. She'd come home late at night, tired but proud of her work. She always told me, a bank isn't just a building with money, it's a place where people's hopes live. He turned to face the room. Every person who walks through those doors carries hopes with them. The student with their first paycheck, the small business owner with their daily deposit, the elderly couple planning their retirement. They all deserve the same respect, the same service, the same smile. A teller who had been quiet until now spoke up. But what about security? We were trained to be cautious. She struggled with the word, knowing now how that caution had been incorrectly applied. Richard walked over to the window, looking out at the street where people were going about their daily lives. Security comes from knowledge, not fear, he said. From this day forward, we'll have proper training. Real security measures based on behavior, not appearance. We'll learn to spot actual suspicious activity, not make assumptions based on how someone looks. He turned back to the room and pulled out several folders from his briefcase. I've already arranged for experts to come in next week. We'll have training sessions on inclusive banking practices, cultural sensitivity, and modern security protocols. Everyone in this room will have the chance to learn, to grow, and to be part of the change. The atmosphere in the room began to shift. Where there had been shame and fear, now there was a glimmer of hope. Some employees sat up straighter, others began taking notes. The change was already beginning. But most importantly, Richard continued, I want each of you to spend time in our community. Visit the local businesses, attend community events, understand the people we serve. Banking isn't just about transactions, it's about relationships. He walked around the table, making eye contact with each person. I'm not here to punish you for the past. I'm here to help us all create a better future. Starting today, Regional Trust Bank will truly live up to its name. We will be worthy of our community's trust. The morning sun had risen higher now, flooding the conference room with warm light. In that moment, as Richard looked at the faces around him, he saw something changing. It wasn't just about one incident or one revelation. It was about transformation, about people beginning to see through new eyes. The following week brought winds of change to Regional Trust Bank. Richard arrived early Monday morning, carrying boxes of fresh pastries from a local bakery run by a family who had been denied a business loan 3 times before. As employees trickled in, they found their usual morning meeting transformed into something entirely different. Good morning, Richard said, standing beside a projector screen. Before we open today, I want to show you something. He clicked a button, and images appeared on the screen. Photographs of local business owners, families, and workers from their community. These are our customers. These are their stories. The first photo showed a mechanic, his hands stained with oil, proudly standing in front of his shop. This is Mr. Thompson. Not our board chairman, but David Thompson. 3 banks turned him down for a loan. Today, his auto repair shop employs 5 people and serves hundreds of customers. The branch manager, who had spent the weekend reflecting deeply on her actions, watched intently. Her notepad was already filled with ideas for changes she wanted to implement. The shame of last week had transformed into a determination to do better. Next came a photo of an elderly couple. The Paddles. They'd been saving for 40 years, putting 3 children through college by running their convenience store. They deserve more than being directed to an ATM when they come in to make their daily deposits. The young teller, who had previously turned away customers with muddy boots, raised his hand. I saw them yesterday, he said. They came in right before closing. I stayed an extra 10 minutes to help them balance their monthly statements. Richard nodded approvingly. As the morning progressed, Richard introduced new policies, but more importantly, new ways of thinking. The security guard, who had previously seen his job as keeping people out, was now being trained to welcome people and while maintaining actual security protocols based on behavior, not appearance. Watch how someone acts, not how they look, the new security trainer explained. A threat doesn't wear any particular clothes or have any specific appearance. Real security comes from observation and understanding. During the lunch break, Richard organized a walking tour of the neighborhood. The bank employees, some of whom had worked there for years without ever visiting local businesses, stepped into the vibrant community they served. They stopped at a small restaurant where the owner, a former chef who had started with just a food cart, shared his story of persistence. When I finally got my loan approved at another bank, he said, it changed my life. Now I employ 15 people, and my daughter is heading to culinary school. Back at the bank, the afternoon was dedicated to practical training. Role-playing exercises helped employees understand how their attitudes and assumptions affected customers. The tellers practiced greeting everyone with the same warm welcome, regardless of appearance. One employee had a breakthrough moment during training. I just realized, she said, her voice thick with emotion, my own grandfather would have been treated poorly here, dressed in his work clothes after a day at the construction site. How did I not see this before? Richard set up a suggestion box, encouraging employees to share ideas for improvement. By day's end, it was overflowing. Ideas ranged from offering banking tutorials in multiple languages to hosting financial literacy workshops for local high school students. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the bank's windows, Richard gathered everyone for a final meeting. The faces looking back at him were different from those he confronted last week. There was hope there now and understanding. "Change doesn't happen overnight," he said, looking around the room. "But it happens every time we choose to see people, really see them, as human beings with dreams, struggles, and potential. Today, we've taken our first real steps toward being the bank our community deserves." The employees left that evening hearing not just new training manuals and policies, but also a new perspective. The bank would open tomorrow not just as a place of business, but as a place of possibility for everyone who walked through its doors. Over the next few months, Regional Trust Bank underwent a remarkable transformation. The changes were visible not just in policies and procedures, but in the very spirit of the place. The cold, intimidating atmosphere had been replaced by genuine warmth and welcome. One morning, Richard noticed the security guard helping an elderly man with a walker through the door. Just 6 months ago, that same guard might have viewed him with suspicion. Now, he was offering the man a chair and asking if he'd like a glass of water while waiting. The branch manager, who had once tried to turn Richard away, had become one of the strongest advocates for change. She was currently sitting with a young couple in work clothes, carefully explaining their mortgage options. "Your work experience in construction is valuable," she said warmly. "It shows reliability and skill. Let's look at how we can make your dream of homeownership a reality." A local food truck owner walked in, his apron still dusted with flour. The tellers greeted him by name, no signs of the previous prejudices that would have marked him as suspicious. He was making his daily deposit, and his business was thriving thanks to a small business loan the bank had recently approved. "You know," the food truck owner said to Richard, who happened to be in the lobby, "before you took over, I couldn't even get past the front door of this place. Now my business is growing, and I'm thinking of opening a small restaurant." The transformation hadn't always been smooth. Some employees had resisted the changes at first, clinging to old habits and biases. But as they saw the positive results, the growing customer base, the thriving local businesses, the grateful faces of people who finally felt welcomed, even the skeptics began to change their minds. Richard had implemented a monthly community dinner where bank employees and local business owners could meet informally. These gatherings helped break down barriers and build real relationships. Tonight was one such dinner, held in the bank's renovated community room. The room buzzed with conversation as people shared stories over plates of food from local restaurants. A young woman stood up to speak, her eyes bright with tears. "6 months ago, I was afraid to walk into this bank," she said. "Today, I'm opening my own bookstore with a loan from Regional Trust. Thank you for seeing me as a person, not just another application to reject." The branch manager wiped away tears of her own. She remembered how she used to judge people the moment they walked through the door. Now she saw potential, determination, and dreams in every face. A retired teacher shared how the bank's new financial literacy program had helped her finally understand how to manage her retirement savings. "I used to feel embarrassed asking questions," she said. "Now I feel empowered to make informed decisions about my future." Richard watched all of this from a quiet corner, remembering that first day when he'd been treated with suspicion and disdain. The change in his employees wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal. They had learned to question their assumptions, to see beyond appearances, to treat everyone with dignity. The young teller who had once hidden behind her computer screen was now conducting workshops for first-time account holders, explaining banking basics with patience and respect. "Everyone deserves to understand how to manage their money," she often said. "It's not just about transactions, it's about building futures." As the evening wound down, Richard stood to address the gathered crowd. The setting sun painted the room in warm colors, highlighting the diverse faces of their community: business owners, workers, retirees, students, all now feeling equally welcome in their local bank. "When I bought this bank," Richard said, his voice carrying across the quiet room, "I didn't just want to change policies. I wanted to change hearts and minds. Looking around this room tonight, I see that change is possible when we choose to open our eyes, our minds, and our hearts to everyone in our community." The applause that followed wasn't just for his words. It was for the journey they had all taken together. From prejudice to understanding, from fear to acceptance, from exclusion to community. 1 year after that fateful morning, Regional Trust Bank had become a model for inclusive banking across the state. News reporters gathered in the lobby, preparing to cover the bank's remarkable story. The same lobby that had once been a place of discrimination was now filled with the buzz of positive energy and achievement. A local TV reporter stood near the entrance, microphone in hand. "What we're seeing here is extraordinary," she said into the camera. "A year ago, this bank was just another financial institution. Today, it's the heartbeat of the community." The cameras panned across the walls, now covered with photos of successful local businesses that the bank had helped launch or expand. Each picture told a story of dreams realized, of barriers broken, of lives changed. Below each photo was a small plaque sharing the business owner's journey. Richard walked through the bank, remembering how different things had been just 12 months ago. The same security guard who had once tried to escort him out now ran a training program teaching other banks how to implement real security measures without bias. "It's about behavior, not appearance," he would always say. "That's what keeps a bank truly secure." The branch manager had recently won a regional award for community banking innovation. Her program, which paired experienced business owners with new entrepreneurs, had helped launch 15 successful small businesses in the past year. "Sometimes all people need is someone to believe in them," she often said, remembering her own journey of transformation. A group of high school students filed in for their weekly financial literacy class, led by bank employees who volunteered their time. The class had become so popular that they had to start a waiting list. "Understanding money shouldn't be a mystery," one teller explained to the cameras. "We're here to help everyone build a strong financial future." The local coffee shop owner, whose loan application had been rejected 3 times before Richard took over, now operated 2 successful locations. She stopped by with coffee and pastries for everyone, a weekly tradition she had started to thank the bank for giving her a chance. "You know what's different about this place?" she told the reporters, gesturing around the busy lobby. "They don't just handle your money, they care about your story. They want to know your dreams, your struggles, your plans. They treat you like family." The young teller who had once called security on Richard was now the head of community outreach. Her office walls were covered with thank you cards from people she had helped. "That day changed my life," she admitted to the news crew. "It opened my eyes to my own prejudices and showed me how to be better." As the afternoon progressed, more community members arrived to share their stories with the reporters. A construction worker described how he no longer had to change clothes before coming to the bank. He was welcomed just as warmly in his work boots as anyone in a business suit. An elderly woman who had witnessed Richard's treatment that first day returned to share her perspective. "I saw the whole thing," she told the cameras. "But what happened afterward? That's the real story. Instead of punishment, there was education. Instead of firing people, there was growth. That's true leadership." The bank's success had caught the attention of the banking industry. Other banks were now sending their employees to learn from Regional Trust's example. Richard had started a consulting program to help other financial institutions implement similar changes. "The numbers speak for themselves," Richard explained to the reporters. "Our customer base has tripled. Loan defaults are down. Small business success rates are up. When you invest in people, all people, everyone profits." As the day wound down and the news crews packed up their equipment, A young entrepreneur walked in, clutching a business plan. The same teller who had once been so unwelcoming greeted her with a genuine smile. "Welcome to Regional Trust," she said warmly. "How can we help make your dreams come true?" Richard watched from his office, knowing that the real story wasn't about him anymore. It was about every person who walked through those doors, about every employee who had learned to see beyond their biases, about a community that had come together to prove that change was possible. 2 years after that transformative morning, Regional Trust Bank hosted a special community celebration. The parking lot had been transformed into a festive space with tables, chairs, and a small stage. People from all walks of life gathered to mark not just the bank's success, but the birth of a new way of banking. Richard stood on the stage, looking out at the crowd. He saw the faces of hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by the bank's transformation. The food for the celebration came from 10 different local restaurants. All of them started with loans from Regional Trust over the past 2 years. "When I walked into this bank 2 years ago," Richard began, his voice carrying across the gathering, "I wasn't just treated poorly. I was judged before I could speak. Today, we're not just celebrating a bank's success. We're celebrating what happens when people open their minds and hearts to change." The branch manager, now promoted to Regional Director of Community Banking, stepped up to share her story. "I used to think I was protecting the bank," she admitted to the crowd. "Instead, I was blocking people's dreams. Learning to see beyond my prejudices didn't just make me a better banker, it made me a better person." A line of people formed at the microphone, each waiting to share their story. A young woman in medical scrubs spoke about how the bank had helped her open her own clinic in an underserved neighborhood. A man in paint-splattered work clothes described how his house painting business had grown from a one-person operation to employing 15 people, thanks to the bank's support. The security guard, who had once tried to escort Richard out, now ran security training programs at banks across the state. "Real security isn't about making assumptions," he told the crowd. "It's about protecting everyone's right to dream big and be treated with respect." Children played in a designated area, supervised by bank employees who volunteered their time. These were the sons and daughters of business owners who had received loans, of employees who had learned valuable lessons about prejudice, of community members who now saw the bank as a partner in their success. The local newspaper editor stood up to speak. "2 years ago, this bank made headlines for all the wrong reasons," she said. "Today, it's making history for all the right ones." Regional Trust has become a blueprint for how financial institutions can serve their entire community. A group of banking industry representatives sat in the audience, taking notes. Regional Trust's model of inclusive banking had caught national attention. Richard now regularly received invitations to speak at banking conferences, sharing how treating people with dignity wasn't just the right thing to do, it was good business. The young teller who had first pressed the security button when Richard walked in now led the bank's mentorship program. "Every mistake can be a stepping stone to something better," she told the gathering. "We learned that judgment closes doors, but understanding opens them." As the evening progressed, Richard introduced a new initiative, a scholarship program for students from underserved communities who wanted to pursue careers in finance. "The next generation of bankers should understand from day one that everyone deserves a chance to build their dreams," he announced. The celebration ended with a surprise presentation. The city mayor stepped forward to present Richard with a key to the city. But Richard didn't accept it alone. He called all his employees onto the stage with him. "This isn't about one person," he said. "This is about what happens when an entire community decides to change together." As the sun set on the celebration, casting warm colors across the gathered crowd, Richard thought about that morning 2 years ago. The prejudice he faced had become the catalyst for change that affected thousands of lives. The bank that had once turned people away now stood as a beacon of hope and possibility. "Our story isn't over," Richard said in his closing remarks. "Every person who walks through our doors writes the next chapter. And as long as there are dreams to build and hopes to fulfill, we'll be here, treating everyone with the dignity they deserve, helping turn possibilities into realities, one person at a time. The applause that followed wasn't just for Richard or the bank. It was for the power of change, the strength of community, and the proof that when people choose to be better, anything is possible.